Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 303, Gloriana. Throughout the winter of 1568-69, the Duke of Norfolk grew increasingly restless over what he saw as the infiltration of hardline Protestants, you know them as Puritans, into Elizabeth's government. Chief amongst these was none other than William Cecil. That November, in fact, it seemed that Cecil would finally fall from power completely, when a Spanish ship carrying 8,500 pounds ran aground near Southampton. The money had been loaned to Philip II by Genoese bankers and was supposed to go to pay his troops fighting in the Netherlands. But Elizabeth confiscated the money and claimed she would repay the loan herself. Norfolk did his best to lay the scandal squarely at Cecil's feet, hoping that might bring him down. While Philip was furious, he had his hands full with the Dutch revolt and did little. Instead of declaring war on England, as some feared he might, Philip seized all the English ships and property he could in the Netherlands and used the funds from that to pay his men as best as he was able. In January 1569, Mary Stuart was moved to Tutbury Castle and placed in the care of the Earl of Shrewsbury, who would remain her jailer for the next 15 years. Mary hated the place and immediately continued her efforts to plot against Elizabeth. She continued passing messages to the Spanish that, with her support, she could make England Catholic again. Norfolk continued scheming all the while to wed Mary himself. His plan was to use the marriage and the promise to maintain the Protestant faith as the basis to restore Mary to her Scottish throne. Then, Elizabeth would be forced to recognize her as her heir, taking the wind out of the sails of the Catholic faction, which would no longer be able to use the now Protestant Mary as their champion. Elizabeth was likely not aware of any of this, though we still cannot confirm that today. Cecil opposed the idea. Now, on Ash Wednesday, Robert Dudley approached the Queen with complaints against Cecil, but it backfired. Elizabeth erupted in a fury and declared she would hear no ill words said about her secretary. Dudley and Norfolk, who had found common cause in their campaign against Cecil, realized they had to back down. William Cecil, for his part, realized he needed to be more careful to not offend Norfolk or Dudley, and honestly did his best going forward to be on friendlier terms with both. But with Elizabeth clearly behind him, everyone realized Cecil was essentially untouchable. Meanwhile, Mary had identified a potential escape route from her prison. Norfolk had at first dismissed the idea of marrying her as treason, but as the months went by, he had given the matter deeper consideration. It seemed to him that if her previous marriage to Bothwell could be annulled, it made sense for the Queen of Scots to marry a loyal English lord who could safeguard Queen Elizabeth's interests when Mary had been restored to her throne. Added to this, of course, he would gain a crown for himself. In May 1569, Mary was overjoyed to receive a formal proposal of marriage through the Bishop of Ross, which Elizabeth was, in theory, to have sanctioned. And by June, Norfolk and her were exchanging the kind of letters that could only be seen as courtship. Signing herself, quote, "Your assured Mary," end quote, the former Scottish queen sent what she wrote as "My Norfolk," a cushion embroidered by herself, which showed a knife cutting down a green vine said to represent Elizabeth. Neither party cherished any romantic notions, by the way. This was not about love. This was a union of ambition. Knowing that the Queen would be against the marriage, since she would anticipate that a man who was ambitious to be the king of the Scots could also covet the throne of England, the Duke attempted in June to canvass the backing of his old rival, Cecil. But Cecil was deeply suspicious of Mary Stuart, and he warned Norfolk that the only way out of this was to confess everything to Elizabeth. Dudley, fearful of the consequences of his involvement, also confided in Cecil, who, though he may have recalled the recent conspiracy against himself, did not actually betray the confidence. Actually, what it turns out is none of these three men, Cecil, Dudley, Norfolk, wanted to divulge the marriage plan to Elizabeth until they were certain they could convince her that it was to her advantage. Norfolk, in the end, was too fearful of Elizabeth's anger to take Cecil's advice and come clean. But someone talked, and by the end of July, the Duke's proposed marriage to Mary Stuart was common knowledge at court. In fact, it turned out most of the counselors were in favor of it. Elizabeth, who learned of the plan through mere court gossip, decided she would meet with Norfolk and give him the chance to come clean, though he evaded her questions. But in August, some supporters of the marriage were dismayed when the Earl of Moray in Scotland informed the Queen that the Scottish lords were not going to accept Mary Stuart back as queen, no matter who her husband was. Neither would Spain support any project that would see Elizabeth replaced with Mary. In June, the Duke of Alba told the Spanish ambassador in England, who was in secret communication with Mary, that Spain was not going to support any conspiracy against Elizabeth, at least not now. Philip, for the moment, his hands full in the Netherlands, had decided to remain neutral. But this ambassador actually didn't listen and continued to encourage Norfolk's marriage ambitions, as well as encouraging rebellion amongst the northern English magnates who tended to be more Catholic. Meanwhile, Norfolk, though he hadn't had the gall to tell Elizabeth any of this, continued his machinations, while simultaneously refusing to admit anything to the Queen, despite reputed efforts to get him to do so. Norfolk seems to have felt he had gone too far with Mary to back out, but he still did not want to confess his actions to Elizabeth for fear of retribution. On September the 6th, Elizabeth summoned Norfolk to her presence and told him in no uncertain terms to stop all these plans. A marriage to Mary was simply out of the question. Yet Norfolk persisted almost as soon as he was out of the Queen's presence, though he was smart enough to at least plead illness when summoned again. To the north, however, a much more dangerous threat to Elizabeth's power was brewing. The North had long been a hotbed of resistance. It had never been reconciled to the new religion, and there were several powerful lords there, notably Northumberland and Westmoreland, who could raise powerful private armies. Now, it seemed, after 11 years of peace, the North was getting ready to muster its strength. Elizabeth and Cecil had always been aware of the situation in the North. What they could not afford, and what they both now feared, was Norfolk joining them and bringing the East into rebellion at the same time as the North. However, Norfolk in reality was actually quite sick, and in no position to raise himself from his bed, let alone raise East Anglia in revolt. He was busy writing to the Queen begging for her forgiveness. Norfolk, fearful that he would be blamed for the rebellion, no matter what he did, now wrote to Westmoreland begging him to call it all off. But on the 3rd of October, Norfolk was arrested on his way to Windsor and confined to the Tower, as were several others who were suspected of treason. On the 16th of October, Cecil warned Elizabeth that the real threat to her throne lay with Mary Stuart, not any of the lords to the north, and used this information to remind her where her duty lay. Quote, "There are degrees of danger. If you would marry, it should be less. Whilst you do not, it will increase. If her person be restrained here or in Scotland, it will be less. If at liberty, greater. If found guilty of her husband's murder, she shall be a person perilous, at least less. If passed over in silence, the scar of the murder will wear out, and the danger greater." End quote. Elizabeth announced in her Privy Council that she wanted Norfolk tried for treason. But Cecil didn't consider the Duke's actions to be within the definition. Quote, "Whereupon I am bold to wish your Majesty would show your intent only to inquire into the fact, and not to speak of it as treason." End quote. In fact, there wasn't actually much evidence that Norfolk's intentions had been treasonable, and there was certainly not enough to convict him. The Queen did not care. She wanted Norfolk tried and executed. But as usual with time, her temper receded. Eventually, she conceded that to proceed against Norfolk without legal cause was to become a tyrant, and she was no tyrant. Norfolk would remain in the Tower for a time, but he would not be tried. Still, when Westmoreland and Northumberland learned of Norfolk's fate, and with the promise of Spanish aid, they mustered their armies, 2,500 strong, and marched south. Their goal was Tutbury, where Mary Stuart was held. And this is the first time that Elizabeth really begins to suspect that Mary was behind the whole affair. She even allowed her counselors to draw up an execution warrant in the event it was discovered that in fact she was involved. Around the same time, there were risings in smaller districts. And so on November the 25th, Mary was moved to the Midlands, firmly Protestant territory. The ports around England were closed. Windsor prepared for a siege. But, unable to catch Mary before she was moved, the Northern Rising quickly lost steam. By the 20th of December, it was over without a fight. A 28,000 royal army, led by the Earl of Sussex, pursued the rebellious earls north when they fled into Scotland. Perhaps the most worrying aspect of the Northern Rising had been Philip II's willingness, potentially, to support it, which demonstrated just how hostile now he was starting to become towards Elizabeth. He had instructed the Duke of Alba to send Mary Stuart 10,000 ducats. Urged on by Cecil, Elizabeth determined to show her suspect that any rebellion against her authority would be punished with the utmost of severity. Quote, "You are proceeded thereunto for the terror of others with expedition. Spare no offenders. We are in nothing moved to spare them," end quote. Such was her command to the Earl of Sussex. And the Earl wasted no time in rounding up the lesser rebels and making a great example of them. Reprisals were unusually savage, and no village was to be without at least one execution. Quote, he would write back, "The bodies to remain till they fall to pieces, where they hang," end quote. By February 4th, 1570, between 600 and 750 commoners had been hanged, and 200 gentry had been deprived of their estates and goods, which were distributed to loyal noblemen. The Queen, however, thought it was unfair that those who had helped to plan the revolt had escaped with their lives, while lesser men suffered the ultimate penalty. Westmoreland ultimately fled to Flanders. Northumberland evaded capture until later on in 1570, but then he was arrested in Scotland, returned to York, and put to death. Plans to execute Mary Stuart, however, were quietly abandoned. Elizabeth came out of the whole affair, her position much stronger. When she opened the Royal Exchange at London in January 1570, she was positively beaming. On that very same day, the regent in Scotland, the Earl of Moray, was assassinated by the Scottish lords who feared he wanted to make himself king. Elizabeth was distraught as she thought about all the chaos along her northern border. The kings of both France and Spain urged Elizabeth to use this opportunity to restore Mary to her throne. The continuing problem of the Queen of Scots was greatly exacerbated when on February 25th, 1570, Pope Pius V, inspired by old reports of the Northern Rising, impulsively published a bull, Regnas in Excelsis, excommunicating Elizabeth, quote, "the pretended Queen of England, the serpent of wickedness," end quote. The bull deprived her of her kingdom, absolved all true Catholics from their allegiance to her, and extended the anathema to all who continued to support her. This was effectively an invitation to Elizabeth's subjects and to foreign princes to rise against her in what would amount to a holy crusade. It also actively encouraged Mary Stuart's supporters to set her up in Elizabeth's place. Most sinister of all, it subverted the loyalty of Elizabeth's Catholic subjects and made every single one of them a potential traitor to be regarded with suspicion. From now on, each one of them would face a choice of loyalty. It would no longer be possible to compromise on matters of conscience. One could not be a loyal Englishman and an ardent Catholic. This, in turn, led to the hardening of attitudes on part of the English Protestants, who became even more patriotic and even more protective toward their queen, their loyalty prompting them to press increasingly for Mary Stuart's execution and for tougher laws against Catholics. The bill's ultimate effect was to turn Catholicism into a political rather than religious issue in England, and because of this, it ultimately failed in its purpose. Most English people ignored it. A man who nailed it to the door of the Bishop of London's palace in St. Paul's churchyard was arrested, tortured, and executed. In the north, where the bull might have once been well received, Catholic power had already been effectively crushed. Nor did the great Catholic monarchs of Spain and France hasten to invade England. On the contrary, actually, both Philip II and Charles IX angrily condemned the Pope for taking such hasty action without consulting them first. Elizabeth herself announced defiantly that no ship of St. Peter would ever enter any of her ports. Otherwise, she was dismissive, and the mainly Protestant Londoners echoed her feelings when they described the bull as, quote, a vain crack of words that made a noise only. After the bull, Elizabeth considered Catholics traitors. If you were Catholic, you were a traitor, and if you died, it wasn't martyrdom for your faith. You had committed treason. This was a major change for Elizabeth. Before 1570, she had never demonstrated any personal animosity toward English Catholics. That would no longer be the case. This was also when Cecil started to organize an efficient espionage network that could detect conspirators. Now, getting back to diplomacy, France kept pressuring Elizabeth to restore Mary. Everyone at court urged Elizabeth not to do it, but in the end, the Queen sent Mary a series of conditions that she would need to meet before Elizabeth would consider releasing her. These included sending James, her son, south to England as a hostage to her behavior. It was not until October, but ultimately, Mary agreed to the terms. But by then, in fact, much earlier, by July, the Earl of Lennox had been appointed the new regent. If there was an opportunity to restore Mary, it had already passed. All of these conspiracies lent more urgency to the argument that Elizabeth needed to marry and produce an heir. Thus, in August, she sent an envoy to the emperor to try and restart the negotiations. But the Archduke said he was no longer interested. In fact, shortly afterwards, he married a Bavarian princess. Then, in September, a new proposal of marriage arrived, this time from Charles IX's brother and heir, the 19-year-old Henri, Duke of Anjou. Charles and Catherine de' Medici hoped by this project to unite England and France in a defensive alliance against Spain. Elizabeth was interested, if only for the political advantages and much-needed friendship that prolonged negotiations with France could bring her. And Cecil began to drop a list of quote-unquote commodities to be gained from the union, putting out feelers as to how serious the French were about it. To this end, he sent the fiercely Protestant Sir Francis Walsingham to Paris, where he would act as Elizabeth's envoy. But once again, religion proved to be the sticking point. Elizabeth insisted that her husband adopt her religious, that is, English religious customs. Anjou would not. He actually wasn't a very good match anyway. Anjou was a notorious womanizer and also a bisexual. In fact, later in life he would appear at court in elaborate female costumes, not something likely to impress the puritanical Walsingham. Now, I want to pause here and talk actually for the rest of the episode about just what kind of queen Elizabeth was. She had now ruled for around 12 years, far more than her siblings combined, and she's going to rule for another 33. Elizabeth would once famously say, quote, "To be a king and wear a crown is more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasure to them that bear it." At the same time, she reveled in and jealously guarded the privileges of her sovereignty. She would also write, quote, "I am answerable to none for my actions otherwise than I shall be disposed of my own free will, but to Almighty God alone." End quote. God, she believed firmly, had persevered and brought her through so many trials to give her the throne, and she was convinced that she reigned by God's special favor. In 1576, she told Parliament, quote, "And as for those rare and special benefits which many years have followed and accompanied me with happy reign, I attribute them to God alone. These 17 years," again she's writing in 1576, "God hath both prospered and protected you with good success under my direction. And I am nothing doubt that the same maintaining hand will guide you still and bring you to the ripeness of perfection." End quote. So as you can see, Elizabeth firmly believed that she had been divinely appointed to be queen. She alone was able to fully comprehend the complexities and mysteries of church and state. Quote, "She is our God on earth," would later remark Lord North. Elizabeth would have to agree. But she was no tyrant. Nothing was more important to Elizabeth than that she ruled with her subjects' love. Sir Walter Raleigh would later note that she was a queen for the small as well as the great. She was a stickler for justice. Her godson later revealed how well she understood how to deal with her subjects. Quote, "Her mind was oft-time like the gentle air that cometh from a westerly point in a summer morn. 'Twas sweet and refreshing to all around. Her speech did win all affections, and her subjects did try to show all love to her commands. For she would say her state did require her to command what she knew her people would willingly do from their own love of her. Herewith did she show her wisdom fully. For who did choose to lose her confidence, or who would withhold a show of love and obedience, when their sovereign said it was their own choice, and not her compulsion? Surely she did play her tables well to gain obedience thus, and without restraint. Again, she could put forth such alterations when obedience was lacking as left no doubt as to who her daughter was." End quote. Elizabeth traveled on progresses as many times as she could. She understood full well that this was an age of personal monarchy, and her people would support a monarch they saw, a monarch at least believed that they knew. She wrote effective speeches in which she would justify her actions to her subjects, something her father never would have thought to do. She was also, from all accounts, an excellent public speaker. But she was Henry's daughter and was not about to let anybody to forget it. She constantly reminded her counselors just how much sterner her father had been. I might use the word tyrannical. She used the word stern. Her command of statesmanship was exceptional. Elizabeth was both astute and pragmatic. Above all, she had two goals. She wanted to provide England with a peaceful and a stable government. She wanted to maintain law and avoid war at all costs. She told her judges that they must stand pro veritae, for the truth, rather than pro regina, for the queen. Cecil would later write in tribute, quote, "There was never so wise woman born as Queen Elizabeth, for she spake and understood all languages, knew all estates and dispositions and princes, and particularly was so expert in her knowledge of her own realm as no counselor she had could tell her what she did not know before." End quote. But for all of this, Elizabeth remained mired in a society deeply prejudiced against women in leadership roles. The example of Queen Mary I had seemed only to confirm suspicions that women inherently made bad sovereigns. A typical example of this male prejudice occurred when a French envoy asked the council to be present at his audience with the Queen, implying that the matters of state he had come to discuss were beyond female understanding. Back came a furious answer from Elizabeth, quote, "The ambassador forgets himself in thinking us incapable of conceiving an answer to his message without the aid of our council. It might be appropriate in France, where the king is young, but we are governing our realm better than the French are theirs," end quote. Elizabeth was no feminist. She accepted the creed of the day that women had serious limitations. She always spoke of herself as, quote, "a woman wanting both wit and memory," end quote. In a self-composed prayer, she actually thanked God for making her a weak woman, but his instrument nonetheless. To combat prejudice and underline her position, she invariably referred to herself as a prince, not princess, comparing herself with kings and emperors, and with some success. At the very end of her reign, she would tell Henry IV of France, quote, "My experience in government has made me so stubborn as to believe that I am not ignorant of what becomes a king," end quote. Elizabeth was a master of using any skill, any attribute to her advantage. She flirted tactically with the men of court to keep them loyal. This stratagem also kept her privy council largely devoid of faction and strife. She was so successful as a monarch that at her death, her subjects considered her one of the best English monarchs of all time, not merely a great queen. Poets and dramatists did plenty for her. In his famous poem, The Fairy Queen, Edmund Spenser referred to her as Gloriana. As loved as she was, Elizabeth was also a master of procrastination. Consider the following from Sir Thomas Smith, one of Elizabeth's secretaries of state. Quote, "It maketh me weary of my life. This time passeth almost irrecoverable, the advantage lost, the charges continuing, nothing resolved. I neither can get the letters signed, nor the letter already signed. But day by day and hour by hour, it is deferred upon until anon, noon, and tomorrow. The lack of a resolute answer from Her Majesty drives me to the wall." End quote. In fact, as she grew older, Elizabeth became increasingly reluctant to sign any sort of document at all. Sometimes she refused to even give verbal assent. One of her favorite mottos was, quote, "I see all, and I say nothing." Elizabeth could be resolute and tough when she had to be, and on 2 known occasions, she did not shrink from authorizing the torture of offenders, which was officially illegal, but in her view, necessary in the interests of national security. In both cases, the victims were involved in plots against the Queen's life, but even so, the jailers in the Tower were aware that her anger would fall upon them if they exceeded their warrant. She absolutely hated executions, and issued reprieves to condemn felons whenever she could, so long as it seemed in the interest of justice. Cecil called her very merciful, and she followed major trials with interest and intervened if she felt it was necessary. She was, in most respects, we'd say, conservative, who respected the old medieval ideal of a hierarchical order within the Christian universe, and she cherished traditional notions of degree, priority, and place. Sir Francis Bacon would later write, quote, "Her Majesty loveth peace. Next, she loveth not change." One of her secretaries, Robert Beale, warned his successor to, quote, "avoid being newfangled, and by all means bringing in new customs," end quote. For all this, Elizabeth could be maddeningly unpredictable, which makes sense given that she, like her father before her, kept her own counsel. One of the criticisms often leveled at her was that Elizabeth was mean, and by this what her critics really meant was that she was stingy with money. She had to be. Mary had left Elizabeth a huge debt, and with an annual income that rarely exceeded £300,000, Elizabeth had to pay her own expenses, plus those of the court and her government. Elizabeth was frugal as a result. She was, in many ways, Henry VII, her grandfather's direct descendant. One thing Elizabeth was very good at was choosing advisors, and that paid dividends. She was surrounded with good counselors, though she was never afraid to go against their advice. She was not afraid, either, to place huge demands on them. One witness recalled she would keep Cecil with her, quote, till late at night discoursing alone, and then call out another at his departure, and try the depth of all around her sometime. Each displayed his wit in private. If any dissembled with her or stood not well to her advisings, she did not let it go unheeded, and sometimes not unpunished. Elizabeth matched every effort her advisers made. In that sense, today, I suppose we would call her a workaholic. Elizabeth, though, generally left day-to-day matters with her council. That was smart. She could take the credit if things went well and avoid the blame if they did not. Parliament, however, was less easily managed than the council, to which it was subordinate. The Queen believed that, as the sovereign, she had absolute authority over Parliament. But the Puritans and the Commons could be relied upon to oppose many measures, and both houses were jealous of their powers and privileges, seeking constantly to extend them. Clashes between the Queen and Parliament were therefore inevitable, and Elizabeth was, on some occasions, forced to concede defeat. Whenever possible, she managed without Parliament. In the 45 years of her reign, it sat for only 10 sessions, which lasted a total of 140 weeks, less than 3 years. The Queen attended only the opening and closing state ceremony, arriving by barge or on horseback. She wrote her own speeches for all of these occasions. If the Commons or Lords wished to speak to her, they sent a delegation to wherever she was staying. After they had addressed her on their knees, she would rise from the throne and bow or curtsy. Messengers brought her news of debates, and Cecil conveyed her wishes to both houses. Elizabeth once reminded the Speaker, quote, "It is in me and my power to call Parliament. It is in my power to end and determine the same. It is in my power to dissent to anything done in the Parliaments." End quote. Certain matters, as we've seen, such as the succession and her marriage, were considered by her inappropriate for discussion by Parliament. The Parliament increasingly thought otherwise. In her foreign policy, Elizabeth sought to preserve England's stability and prosperity in a Europe that was, for the moment, dominated by the two great Catholic powers, France and Spain. She achieved this by a policy of diplomacy that was not willingly understood by her own advisers. She hated war because it threatened her kingdom's stability and her treasury. Unlike Philip II, she had no desire to found an empire, and in 1593 she would tell Parliament, quote, "It may be thought simplicity in me, that all this time of my reign I have not sought to advance my territories and enlarge my domains, for opportunity hath served me to do it. My mind was never to invade my neighbors or usurp over any. I am contented to reign over mine and to rule as a just prince." Now, Elizabeth was complicated. She loved to learn. She also spent 3 hours a day reading history books and loved philosophy. She also loved practical jokes, as had her mother, Anne Boleyn. As I mentioned in one of our first episodes on Elizabeth's reign, she thoroughly enjoyed dancing, hunting, and especially riding. And like her father, she enjoyed both hearing and performing musical works. She was, evidently, quite skilled at the lute. Though she was interested in the more practical sciences, she also employed astrologers, particularly the noted astrologer and suspected wizard, Dr. John Dee. Unlike both of her half-siblings, Elizabeth enjoyed good health basically her whole life. Right up to the very end of her reign, she maintained her faculties, though she did suffer from bouts of anxiety, mostly as the result of the trauma she experienced early in life. Late in life, the Queen did find herself plagued by headaches. Doctors did as much harm as good in the 16th century, and Elizabeth seems to have recognized this. She consulted them as rarely as she could. In Tudor times, the royal image was all important, and much more so than today. Magnificence was regarded as being synonymous with power. The Tudor monarchs were renowned for their splendor, no less than their personal charm. Elizabeth's wardrobe, which was rumored to contain more than 3,000 gowns, became legendary during her lifetime, as her costumes grew ever more flamboyant. The image of a godly Protestant virgin in sober black and white, so carefully cultivated by Elizabeth during her half-sister's reign, soon vanished, and there emerged an altogether more colorful and showy image. The Queen's portraits always show her in dresses of silk, velvet satin, cloth of gold encrusted with real gems, pearls, and embroidery. Her favorite colors were black, white, and silver, worn with transparent silver veils. Some of Elizabeth's dresses and other clothing were presented to her by gifts by her courtiers, and many certainly remained unworn. These, with other discarded dresses, she gave to her ladies. However, Elizabeth absolutely appreciated the many gifts of clothing from friends and courtiers. In 1575, having given the Queen a blue cloak embroidered with flowers and trimmed with velvet, Bess of Hardick was gratified to learn from a friend that, quote, "Her Majesty never liked anything you gave her so well. The colour and strange trimming of the garment, with the great cost bestowed upon it, hath caused her to give out such good speeches of your ladyship as I have never heard better." One courtier described her physical appearance as follows, quote, "Slender and straight, her hair was inclined to pale yellow, her forehead large and fair, her eyes lively and sweet, but short-sighted, her nose somewhat rising in the middle, her countenance was somewhat long, but yet of admiring beauty, and a most delightful composition of majesty and modesty." The portraits of Elizabeth I are the subject of, quite frankly, more books than I can even recount. Although there is a great demand for her portrait in the years after her accession, she was, according to William Cecil, quote, "very unwilling to have a natural representation," end quote. And therefore, there was a large number of likenesses that were produced that were probably very inaccurate. The very earliest portraits are half-lengths, showing the Queen full-faced, wearing a French hood. Only a few examples of this survive. She was depicted full-face in her coronation portrait. This painting, on a wooden panel, has been tree ring dated to around 1600, and it's probably a copy of a lost original, which may have been the work of a Flemish woman artist who painted many miniatures for the Queen during the early years of her reign. In reality, all we have to show us what Elizabeth I, Gloriana, looked like are stylized images. Painters, of course, were keen to flatter the Queen, and she no doubt encouraged them to do so over her 45-year reign. If we had a photograph of Elizabeth, the difference between that and one of our paintings would likely be dramatic. But frankly, for one, I'm happy we don't. So next week, we are headed back to France to follow Catherine de' Medici, Charles IX, and of course, the Guise family, as they try to pull the kingdom through its ongoing religious turmoil. If you need more Western Civ in the interim, check out the link in the show notes for a free 7-day trial of Western Civ 2.0. We're now deep into the Punic Wars back in ancient Roman history, and I know how much of a fan everyone is for that, and it is a great way to support the show.